I never thought one trip could change my life forever. But that's exactly what happened when I decided to join my stepbrother, Ethan, on a weekend getaway. It was supposed to be a chance for us to relax and escape the stress we'd both been dealing with. Instead, it became something I can't stop thinking about, and something I can never tell anyone. Ethan and I weren't particularly close growing up. We were always friendly, but more like distant acquaintances than family. After my mom married his dad, we barely spent any time together. But when his dad passed away a few months ago, Ethan reached out. He said he needed to get away, and honestly, I did too. The plan was simple: a quiet cabin in the woods, just the two of us, away from everyone and everything. I wasn't nervous at first, but something changed the moment we arrived. The air felt different, heavy, like something unspoken was waiting for us. The cabin was cozy, with a crackling fireplace and large windows overlooking the forest. It felt safe and isolated, which was what we wanted, or so I thought. That first night, we opened a bottle of wine and started talking. Really talking. It felt good to let our guards down, to share things we'd never told anyone else. But then something shifted. I don't even know when it happened, but suddenly, I wasn't looking at him like a brother anymore. The way he smiled at me, the way his eyes lingered, it made my heart race. And the worst part, I could feel it happening to him too. It started innocently enough. He brushed a strand of hair from my face, his fingers lingering just a second too long. I felt my breath catch, but I didn't pull away. Instead, I leaned in. "Is this weird?" he asked, his voice low and unsure. "Yes," I whispered, but I didn't stop. Neither did he. His hand moved to my cheek, and before I knew it, our lips were inches apart. My mind screamed at me to stop, but my body didn't listen. When his lips finally touched mine, I felt something I hadn't felt in years, alive. We pulled away almost immediately, both of us breathing hard and wide-eyed. "We can't," I said, but even as I spoke the words, I knew I didn't mean them. Ethan stared at me, his chest rising and falling, and for a moment I thought he'd agree. But instead, he leaned in again, his lips brushing mine, softer this time, more deliberate. And I let him. I knew we were crossing a line we couldn't come back from, but I didn't care. Not then. All I cared about was the way he made me feel, wanted, desired, and completely out of control. If only I knew what would happen next. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel if you want to hear the rest of the story. Things are about to get even more intense, and you won't want to miss it. I barely slept that night. My mind kept replaying what had happened, how his lips felt, the way his hands lingered on me, and the look in his eyes that made my stomach twist in ways I didn't want to admit. I told myself it was just the wine, just the emotions from everything we'd been through. But deep down, I knew that was a lie. The next morning, I tried to act normal. I avoided his eyes as I made coffee, but I could feel him watching me. The tension in the room was unbearable. Finally, he broke the silence. "About last night," he started, his voice soft. I froze, my hands gripping the edge of the counter. "We shouldn't talk about it," I said quickly, trying to shut it down. But Ethan didn't let it go. He stepped closer, his body so near that I could feel the heat radiating off him. "Why not? It happened, and it didn't feel wrong." I turned to face him, my heart pounding. "It did," I insisted, but the words came out shaky, unconvincing. "Then why are you shaking?" he whispered, his fingers brushing against my arm, sending shivers through me. I stepped back, but there was nowhere to go. The counter was behind me, and Ethan was in front of me, closing the distance with every step. I hated how much I wanted him to keep coming closer. "We can't do this," I said again, but my voice was weaker this time. He reached out, cupping my face in his hands, his thumb grazing my lower lip. "Tell me to stop," he said, his voice low and rough. I opened my mouth to say it, to tell him to stop, but no words came out. Instead, I leaned into his touch, and that's when he kissed me again. This time, it wasn't soft or hesitant. It was hungry, desperate, and I matched his intensity. His hands slid down my body, pulling me closer until there was no space between us. I felt his breath hot against my neck as his lips trailed lower, making my knees weak. I should have stopped it, I knew I should, but I didn't. Instead, I let myself get lost in him, in the way he made me feel like the only woman in the world. When he finally pulled away, his eyes were dark and filled with something I couldn't quite place, desire, guilt, maybe both. "This is dangerous," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. "I know," I replied, my fingers still tangled in his hair. But neither of us moved. We stood there, breathing hard, staring at each other like we were already too far gone to turn back. And maybe we were. Stay tuned for the next part. Things are about to get even more intense. Make sure you don't miss it. The rest of the day felt like walking on a tightrope. Every glance, every accidental touch sent a spark through me, making it impossible to focus on anything else. Ethan tried to act normal, but I could tell he felt it too. The tension, the pull between us that we both knew we shouldn't give in to again. We decided to go for a hike to clear our heads. The fresh air and towering trees felt like a welcome distraction. But even out there, away from the cabin, I couldn't escape the way he looked at me. It wasn't just in my head. It was real, and it was dangerous. At one point, I slipped on the uneven trail, and before I could fall, Ethan's arms were around me. His grip was firm, protective, but the way his hands lingered on my waist made my skin burn. "Careful," he said, his voice low and rough. I swallowed hard, trying to step away, but he didn't let go. Instead, he pulled me closer, his eyes locked on mine. "Ethan," I started, but he cut me off. "Don't fight this," he whispered, his breath warm against my face. "You feel it too." "I know you do." I didn't answer. I couldn't, because he was right. I felt it, every look, every touch, every moment we shared felt like it was leading to this. Before I could stop him, or myself, his lips were on mine again, this time even hungrier than before. I gasped against his mouth, and he took it as permission to deepen the kiss, his hands roaming my back as he pressed me against a tree. I should have stopped it, but I didn't. Instead, I let my hands explore his body, feeling the strength beneath his shirt. His fingers slipped under my top, grazing my skin and making me shiver. "This is crazy," I whispered between kisses, but I didn't pull away. "Maybe," he murmured, his lips trailing down my neck, leaving a path of heat in their wake. "But it doesn't feel wrong." And in that moment, it didn't. All I cared about was the way he made me feel, wanted, alive, and completely out of control. We eventually pulled away, breathless and shaken. I couldn't even look at him as we made our way back to the cabin, but I could still feel his touch on my skin. That night, we sat by the fireplace, trying to pretend nothing had happened. But the silence between us spoke louder than words. "This can't happen again," I finally said, breaking the tension. Ethan looked at me, his jaw tight. "Do you really believe that?" I didn't answer. I couldn't, because deep down I knew the truth. And so did he. Don't miss the next part. It's only going to get more intense from here. I told myself I'd keep my distance. I told myself what happened in the woods was a mistake, a moment of weakness we could move past. But the second I saw Ethan the next morning, all those promises fell apart. He was standing in the kitchen, shirtless, making coffee like nothing had happened. His toned muscles and the faint trail of stubble along his jaw made my heart race in ways I couldn't control. I froze in the doorway, my body betraying me as I soaked in the sight of him. "Morning," he said, flashing me a casual smile, as if we hadn't spent the previous day tangled up in each other. I tried to play it cool. "Morning," I replied, but my voice came out shakier than I wanted. He stepped closer, his eyes darkening as he leaned in. "You didn't sleep well," he said, his voice low and knowing. I stepped back, desperate to create space, but my back hit the counter. He was right there, his body so close I could feel the heat radiating off him. "Ethan, we can't keep doing this," I whispered, even as my breath quickened. "Why not?" he asked, his hand brushing against mine. "Because someone might find out. Or because you don't trust yourself around me?" His words hit me like a punch to the stomach, because they were true. I didn't trust myself, not when he looked at me like that. Before I could respond, he leaned in, his lips brushing against my ear. "Tell me to stop," he whispered, his breath sending shivers down my spine. But I couldn't say it. Instead, I closed my eyes, letting his hands slide down my arms, his fingers tracing my skin in ways that made my body ache for more. His lips found mine, and this time, there was no hesitation, only raw hunger. My fingers tangled in his hair as he lifted me onto the counter, his hands exploring my body like he couldn't get enough. "This is wrong," I gasped, but even as I said the words, I arched into him, craving his touch. "Then stop me," he challenged, his voice rough and full of need. I didn't. His lips moved to my neck, leaving a trail of heat as his hands pushed up my shirt, his fingertips grazing my bare skin. I let out a soft moan, and that was all it took for him to lose control. He pressed me harder against the counter, his body pinning mine as his mouth claimed every inch of exposed skin. My pulse raced, and for the first time, I didn't care about the consequences. When we finally pulled apart, we were both breathless, our eyes locked as reality crashed back in. "This is dangerous," he said, his voice low and shaky. "I know," I whispered. But even as I said it, I already knew it wouldn't be the last time. "Things are only heating up. Stay tuned for the next part to see what happens next. I couldn't look him in the eye after what happened in the kitchen. My body still burned from his touch, but my mind wouldn't stop screaming at me. This wasn't normal. This wasn't right. I spent most of the day avoiding him, trying to convince myself that I could shut it all down. But no matter what I did, the memory of his lips, his hands, his body pressed against mine haunted me. By evening, the tension in the cabin was unbearable. I couldn't hide anymore, and when Ethan suggested we sit outside by the fire pit, I agreed, hoping the fresh air would clear my head. But being alone with him in the dim glow of the flames only made things worse. We sat in silence for a while, both pretending not to notice how close we were sitting. The air between us felt heavy, charged with everything we weren't saying. Finally, Ethan broke the silence. "We need to talk about this," he said, his voice low but firm. I swallowed hard, keeping my eyes fixed on the fire. "What's there to talk about?" "Us," he said, his hand brushing against mine. Even that small touch sent shivers through me. "We can't pretend this isn't happening." I turned to face him, my heart pounding. "It shouldn't be happening," I said, but the words felt weak even as I spoke them. His eyes locked onto mine, intense and unrelenting. "But it is." Before I could respond, he leaned in, closing the distance between us. This time, I didn't fight it. I couldn't. His lips captured mine, and everything else melted away. The fire crackled behind us as his hands moved over my body, pulling me closer until I was straddling his lap. My heart raced as his fingers slipped under my shirt, grazing my bare skin and sending heat flooding through me. "This is wrong," I whispered, but even as I said it, I was pulling him closer, desperate for more. "Then tell me to stop," he murmured against my lips, his hands sliding lower. I didn't. His mouth found my neck, trailing kisses that left me breathless. My fingers tangled in his hair, and I gasped as he pulled me tighter against him, his body hard and demanding. The flames danced in the background, casting shadows around us, but all I could feel was him, his touch, his heat, his need. By the time we finally pulled apart, my body was trembling, and I could barely catch my breath. "This is dangerous," he said again, his voice rough. "I know," I whispered, my fingers still resting on his chest. But even as the guilt crept in, I knew I wouldn't stop. I couldn't, and deep down, I wasn't sure I wanted to. Don't miss the next part, it's about to get even more intense. I woke up the next morning tangled in guilt and desire. My body still ached from the way Ethan had touched me by the fire, but my mind wouldn't let me forget how wrong it all felt. I told myself I'd put some distance between us, that I'd be strong enough to stop whatever this was from going any further. But the moment I saw him, standing in the kitchen shirtless again, every rational thought disappeared. "Morning," he said, his voice soft but heavy, like he hadn't slept much either. I nodded, avoiding his eyes. "Morning." But Ethan wasn't the type to let things go. He moved closer, closing the space between us until I was pressed against the counter. "Are we just going to pretend last night didn't happen?" he asked, his voice low and rough. I swallowed hard, trying to ignore the way my body reacted to him. "We have to." "Why?" He leaned in, his lips dangerously close to mine. "Because it's wrong. Or because you're scared of how much you want it." His words hit me like a punch to the stomach, because he was right. I was scared, not just of what we were doing, but of how much I didn't want to stop. Before I could answer, his hand brushed against my arm, sending chills through me. "You're shaking," he whispered. I stepped back, but he didn't let me go. Instead, he grabbed my waist, pulling me against him. My breath hitched as his lips found my neck, and suddenly, all my resolve melted away. "Ethan," I whispered, but it wasn't a protest. He groaned softly, his lips trailing down to my collarbone as his hands gripped my hips. I arched into him, my fingers tangling in his hair, as he pressed me harder against the counter. "We shouldn't," I tried to say, but my voice was lost in the heat of the moment. His hands slipped under my shirt, sliding over my bare skin and leaving a trail of fire in their wake. My breath quickened as he lifted me onto the counter, his body pressing between my legs. "This is wrong," he murmured, but his lips never stopped moving, never stopped claiming every inch of me they could reach. "I don't care," I gasped, pulling him closer. And I didn't. Not in that moment. All I cared about was the way he made me feel. Alive, wanted, completely out of control. We didn't stop. Not this time. When it was over, we sat in silence, both of us struggling to catch our breath. Ethan reached out, brushing a strand of hair from my face, and I leaned into his touch without thinking. "This is dangerous," he said, his voice soft but serious. "I know," I whispered. But deep down, we both knew there was no going back now. Things are spiraling fast. Don't miss the next part to see where this forbidden desire leads. I told myself that what happened on the counter would be the last time. I swore I'd put an end to it before it went any further. But the more I tried to resist, the harder it became to stop thinking about him, about his touch, his lips, the way he made me feel like I was the only woman in the world. The worst part? Ethan wasn't even trying to hide it anymore. Every glance, every accidental brush of his fingers, every lingering touch felt deliberate, like he was daring me to give in again. And I did. That night, the power went out. The cabin was plunged into darkness, and the only light came from the fireplace. It felt intimate, too intimate, and I knew I should have gone to bed. Instead, I stayed, curled up next to Ethan on the couch. We didn't talk at first. The silence between us felt heavy, like we were both waiting for the other to make a move. When he finally reached out and brushed his fingers against mine, my breath caught, but I didn't pull away. "You're shaking," he whispered just like before. I turned to face him, and in the dim light, I could see the same hunger in his eyes that I felt burning inside me. "I can't stop thinking about you," he admitted, his voice rough and raw. I should have said something to stop him, to stop us, but instead, I let him pull me closer. His lips found mine, and this time there was no hesitation. It was desperate and needy, and I matched his intensity, my body melting into his. He lifted me into his lap, his hands roaming my body as my fingers tangled in his hair. The heat between us built quickly, and when his lips moved to my neck, I gasped, tilting my head back to give him more access. "Ethan," I whispered, my voice trembling. "I need you," he murmured against my skin, his words sending shivers down my spine. I should have stopped it. I knew I should have, but I couldn't. Not when his hands were sliding under my shirt, pushing it over my head and leaving me bare to his touch. We didn't make it to the bedroom. Right there, in front of the fire, we gave in completely, our bodies tangled together as the heat consumed us. When it was over, we lay there in silence, wrapped in each other's arms. I knew I should feel guilty, but all I felt was safe, like I belonged there with him. "This can't keep happening," I finally whispered, even though I knew it was already too late. Ethan tightened his arms around me, his lips brushing against my forehead. "We'll figure it out," he said softly. But as much as I wanted to believe him, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were heading towards something we couldn't come back from. Don't miss the next part. It's only going to get more complicated from here. The next morning, I woke up tangled in Ethan's arms. The warmth of his body pressed against mine felt too good, too comforting, and too dangerous. For a moment, I let myself stay there, pretending everything was normal. But the second his hand slid down my waist, pulling me closer, reality came crashing back. I pulled away, sitting up quickly and reaching for my clothes. "We can't keep doing this," I said, my voice shaky. Ethan sat up, his eyes dark and unreadable. "We already are," he said simply. His words hit me hard because he was right. We'd already crossed every line, and there was no taking it back now. "I don't know how to stop," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. Ethan reached for me, his fingers brushing my arm. "Then don't." I looked at him, my heart pounding. "We're playing with fire." His eyes locked onto mine, intense and unrelenting. "Then let it burn." Before I could respond, he was on me again, his lips crashing against mine. I melted into him, my body betraying every rational thought in my head. This time, it wasn't soft or hesitant. It was raw and desperate, like we both knew we were past the point of no return. His hand slid under my shirt, pushing it up and over my head as he laid me back down. My breath hitched as his lips trailed down my neck, leaving a path of fire in their wake. "Ethan," I gasped, my fingers digging into his back as he pressed his body against mine. "I need you," he murmured, his voice rough and full of hunger. I didn't stop him. I couldn't. Not when every touch, every kiss made me crave him even more. We lost ourselves in each other again, tangled in sheets and forbidden desire. And even as guilt clawed at the back of my mind, I couldn't bring myself to care. When it was over, we lay there in silence, both of us trying to catch our breath. "This is dangerous," I said softly, echoing the words we'd repeated so many times before. Ethan reached out, brushing a strand of hair from my face. "Maybe," he said, "but it feels right." I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe we could keep this secret, keep pretending everything was fine. But deep down, I knew the truth. Secrets like this never stay buried. Don't miss the next part. Things are about to unravel, and the consequences will be impossible to ignore. The guilt hit me harder than ever the next morning. I couldn't look at Ethan without remembering the way he'd touched me, the way I'd let him. My body still ached from the night before, but it was nothing compared to the ache in my chest. We didn't talk much as we packed up the cabin. The silence between us felt heavier than it ever had, and every time our eyes met, I saw the same mix of guilt and desire that was eating me alive. On the drive home, Ethan kept glancing at me like he wanted to say something, but he never did. And honestly, I wasn't sure I wanted him to. Talking about it would only make it more real, more impossible to ignore. But ignoring it didn't make it go away. When we got back to the house, the tension was unbearable. I tried to escape to my room, but Ethan followed me, closing the door behind him. "We need to talk," he said, his voice low but firm. I shook my head, backing away. "No, we don't. We need to forget this ever happened." His eyes darkened. "You really think we can forget?" I opened my mouth to argue, but the words died on my lips as he stepped closer. My heart raced as he reached out, his fingers brushing against my arm. "Don't," I whispered, even as my body leaned into his touch. "Why not?" he murmured, his voice rough and full of need. "We can't undo it, so why keep pretending?" "Because it's wrong." I snapped, but my voice wavered, betraying me. "Then why does it feel so right?" He cupped my face, forcing me to look at him. "Tell me you don't want this. Tell me you don't want me." I opened my mouth to say it, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I let out a shaky breath, and that was all it took. His lips were on mine again, and this time there was no hesitation, no guilt, just raw, desperate hunger. I moaned against him as his hands slid down my body, pulling me closer until there was nothing between us. We stumbled back onto the bed, tearing at each other's clothes like we couldn't get close enough. My pulse raced as his lips trailed down my neck, his hands exploring every inch of me. "Ethan," I gasped, arching into him as he pressed me into the mattress. He groaned, his voice low and full of need. "You're mine." And in that moment, I wanted to be. We didn't stop, not this time. We gave in completely, losing ourselves in each other over and over again until there was no turning back. But as we lay there afterward, tangled in sheets and silence, reality came crashing back. "This can't end well," I whispered, my voice trembling. Ethan didn't answer. He just pulled me closer, like he could protect me from the truth. But deep down, we both knew it was only a matter of time before everything fell apart. The final part is coming. Don't miss the shocking conclusion to this forbidden story. The days that followed were a blur of stolen touches, whispered promises, and moments so intense they left me breathless. But beneath it all, the guilt was growing, thick, suffocating, and impossible to ignore. Ethan tried to act like everything was fine, like we could keep living in this secret world we'd created. But I could see the cracks forming, the tension in his jaw, the way his hands lingered on me as if he was afraid to let go. I felt it too, the fear, the dread of what would happen if anyone found out. One night, as we lay tangled together in his bed, I finally said what had been weighing on me. "We can't keep doing this." My voice cracked, and my heart felt like it was shattering as I spoke the words. Ethan stiffened beside me. "Don't say that." I sat up, pulling the sheet around me like it could protect me from the reality we'd been avoiding. "We have to stop. This isn't sustainable." He sat up too, his eyes dark and desperate. "You don't mean that." "I do," I whispered, even as tears blurred my vision. "We're playing with fire, Ethan. And it's only a matter of time before we get burned." He reached for me, but this time I pulled away. "You're scared," he said softly. "Of course I'm scared." I snapped. "This isn't just risky, it's wrong." "But it doesn't feel wrong," he argued, his voice raw. "Not when I'm with you. Not when I look at you and feel like I finally found someone who understands me." His words broke something inside me. I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe that love, no matter how forbidden, was enough. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. "We have to let this go," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. He didn't argue this time. Instead, he nodded slowly, his eyes filled with a pain that mirrored my own. The next few days were agonizing. We avoided each other, giving ourselves space to process what we'd done and what we'd lost. But no matter how much distance I tried to put between us, my heart still ached for him. And I knew his heart ached too. The night before I left, Ethan found me sitting on the porch, staring at the stars. He didn't say anything at first. He just sat down beside me, his shoulder brushing against mine. "I'll never regret what happened between us," he said softly. Not for a second. I turned to face him, my eyes brimming with tears. "Neither will I." We sat there in silence, knowing it was the last time we'd allow ourselves to be this close. When I finally stood to go inside, Ethan caught my hand and pressed a soft kiss to my knuckles. It was tender, bittersweet, and final. And as much as it hurt, I knew it was the right thing to do. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to the channel for more intense and emotional stories like this one. Stay tuned for the next forbidden tale. You won't want to miss it.